Okay, so the trade balance. So Ethiopia suffers a negative trade balance of $5.8 billion in net imports, and the government looks to lessen this trade deficit by suppressing imports. And it also has a negative current account balance, so it has a current account deficit of negative $6.551 billion. So basically, what we can draw from here is that Ethiopia imports more than it exports, and it's one of the government's economic objectives, as I've already mentioned, to lessen and alleviate, to improve the um this current account deficit. And once again, the coronavirus will stand in the way of this. Okay, developmental economics. So, uh, Ethiopia has an HDI, Human Development Index, of 0.47, that which ranks it 173rd in the world, which shows massive room for improvement there. And Ethiopia spends 4% of its GDP on health, and remittances and inflows account for 0.49% of the GDP, which is generally speaking not that much. And this can be seen as actually a positive development because Prime Minister Abiy's reforms has attracted a lot of the Ethiopian diaspora to come back and work in Ethiopia. So that also had reduced remittances. So the populations aged 65 and older, particularly at a huge risk factor of this pandemic, there are 3.8 million people, and the old age dependency ratio so like a number of dependents per a number of old age dependents per 100 people of working age is 6.3, which is not that bad. And the population using improved sanitation facilities, now this is where it bothers me more, is just 7%. So sanitation facilities still today remain a huge developmental obstacle for Ethiopia, and it relies on its international partners like the United Nations and the IMF to provide funding that would help improve the basic access to improved sanitation. There are 0.77 medical doctors per 10,000 people and zero point 0.1 physicians per 1,000 people, um, which is quite common amongst African and developing nations. It doesn't compare to the ranks of developed countries. However, Ethiopian medical reforms have sufficiently tackled the brain drain of medical personnel, uh, and thus they were able to greatly increase human resources of health the previous years, and quite timely for today's pandemic, I'd say. So the Global Health Index, which basically states how prepared Ethiopia is. It takes various factors, very multifaceted in its approach, the way it gathers information. Um, and it ranked Ethiopia 40.6 figure, which is 84th in the world and 5th in Africa. So Ethiopia remains one of the more brighter, let's say, the best of worst African prospects in terms of how much of a developmental burden this an obstacle will be. So it has a quality of life index of 65.81. That is a low number. So the standard of living in Ethiopia is low. The purchasing power of Ethiopians is low. Um, uh, and the healthcare index is moderate, and the healthcare system has seen improvements over the years. However, we've seen European countries with far greater healthcare facilities struggling to deal with this pandemic. So this statistics should not fool us in that sense. Humanitarian vulnerabilities. So Ethiopia is notorious for its internally displaced peoples. It has more than 3 million recorded in 2019 as a result of ethnic tensions and and political tensions as a consequence of the political transition that occurs. Outbreaks of cholera and measles in rural areas are present. Then many environmental disasters such as flooding, droughts, and the recent locust invasions are all a huge are all a huge obstacle for Ethiopians, and this locust invasion, which has negatively impacted not just Ethiopia but most of the sub-Saharan region, could not come at a worse time. It came right at the baby stages of this pandemic in Africa. So 62 million Ethiopians today lack access to safe water, and 97 million lack access to improved sanitation. So we see massive signs and needs for action here, and 70%. But however, granted that the government is fighting for Ethiopia's development, we can see that 76% of the humanitarian response plan, which is co-written with Ethiopia and the United Nations, the government funds 76% of it, along with NGOs like Water Organization and the UN. And here is just a breakdown. So the current status of the coronavirus pandemic in Ethiopia. So we see here that the cases have seemed to peak around April 20th, and then there seemed to have been a slowdown in new cases. However, once again, there has been an increase, and this is the latest has been closer to May 6th. And currently, there are 194 as of now cases, 4 deaths, and 95 recoveries. So far, it hasn't been statistically an extremely alarming sight. However, it's important to note that the testing capacities of Ethiopia are very limited. And what's even more limited is the access to medical equipment imperative for patients in critical conditions, such as ventilators. As far as I'm concerned, the last research I made, there were about 220 ventilators in the country. So the government measure in response to the coronavirus has been a state of emergency declared on April 8th. So they closed borders, schools, universities, and they recommended that non-essential businesses operate from home. Essential workers are still allowed to work, and some non-essential businesses remained open because it's hard to impose lockdown measures, which I will explain later why. No large gatherings, cleaning and sanitation of public spaces. So the government is indeed trying to sanitize public spaces and large open markets Ethiopians are known for. However, the lack of access, the rural population's lack of access to improved sanitation and clean water uh, can basically show a backward trend here. Uh, and most eminently strict social distancing. So it is extremely hard to follow and monitor informal settlements in many Ethiopian cities, and especially to spread awareness. Because a lot of Ethiopians don't have access to media or internet like we do, um, and furthermore, it's even harder to monitor internally displaced people. And Ethiopia has one of the largest populations of internally displaced people in the world. The government also tried to tackle this by using domestic and economic trade reforms, which account for a more long term view. The government delayed elections, which is a good thing to avoid mass gatherings, but it does hinder the democratic freedom of the in a sense, which is a developmental feature. So the government also is distributing assistance to regional health systems, and tax relief is being offered to small businesses affected. So support from foreign governments. So Ethiopia is heavily reliant on foreign aid for numerous factors that have been discussed before. So the economic growth and development of Ethiopia is achieved by public investment in infrastructure, education, and culture. However, this comes all in complement with foreign aid. A lot of that money is comes from foreign partners, and programs such as the World Food Program and health assistance is vital for Ethiopian food and health security. The IDA is Ethiopia's largest provider of official developmental assistance. So it committed over 20 billion to more than 80 projects, $20 billion to more than 80 projects in Ethiopia since 1991. Um, However, Ethiopia recorded a government. This is not. This is in regards to multilateral aid, multilateral loans. Ethiopia recorded a government debt equivalent of 50% of its gross domestic product in GDP. Um, and what aggravates this even more is that birr is a non-convertible currency, making it harder to repay this debt. Um, Abiy's call to foreign creditors. This is what Prime Minister Abiy has said to his key international strategic partners. He posted this on his Twitter account, that 2.1 billion US dollars from international lenders and bilateral partners are given. Here I have a few tweets from Prime Minister Abiy. So here are one of his views. Here he states the need for global cooperation and leadership, saving economy's health system, ensuring food security for most vulnerable, and the need to intensify efforts on debt relief. So he has been adamant on debt relief. Uh, and we can see here some of the successes. The IMF board approved a highly needed financing of $411 million for Ethiopian uh, finance program for vital for its economy. And moving back to our presentation, Germany extended $130 million. There are medical supplies such as ventilators, masks, and surgical gear coming from China as a donation, free of cost. And Abiy Ahmed further calls for a 150 billion dollars aid package for African nations as a necessary means for combating this pandemic, which has with this call for help has yet to be answered. And he obviously calls for the forgiveness and or the delay of debt payments until the pandemic is over. So Ethiopia spends twice more on servicing debt than on healthcare, and the International Monetary Fund described Ethiopia as being at a high risk of external debt distress. So Ethiopia lacks a nationwide advanced healthcare system, which it needs to mobilize all its resources, and it it in order to do so, it might even require new foreign credit to invest in this long-lasting medical infrastructure. So. Uh, Debt forgiveness might not be actually enough for African nations like Ethiopia to properly combat and prevent further repetitions or second, third, fourth, whichever waves of the coronavirus. So the good news is on April 15th, G20, we celebrated this in class. G20 countries offered temporary debt relief to world LDCs.